All right, so I'll say good morning, good morning. Let us begin by thanking all of our sponsors for this morning's share. To thank our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Kislev, Abba Alina Latova, Ellison and Adam Steinmetz, in memory of Adam's grandfather, Rabbi Sheldon Steinmetz Harav, Shlomo Tzvi Ruvain Ben Shimon Zichron Livracha. And in honor of Meretz Hashem, that is Neshama Shtav and Aliyah, Shvei Melis Yosef for his children, his grandchildren, and Kenainar his 36 great-grandchildren. Semi and Malka Esther, in the memory of their parents, Yitzchak Leib Ben Aaron HaKohen, Sarah Rachel Bas Baruch Avram, Hinda Bas Henech Ephraim, and in memory of their dear family friend, Staff Sergeant Naftali Yonah Gordon Hashem Yikom Damo, fell in battle in Gaza on Erev Chanukah 2023. Paul and Kathy Pollack, in memory of Paul's Mishpacha, Leah Bas Shmuel, Zachrini Shulamis Bas Shmuel, and Esther Bas Zechariah. Our Daf Yomi sponsors for today, Ayala and Sarah Steinberg, and the schools of continued refuah for Shulamis Chana Bas Susha, and for a continued refuah Shlema, and Paul and Kathy Pollack, in honor of the yard site of the Magid of Mezrich. Rav Dov Ber was the primary disciple of Talmud Mufak of the Baal Shem Tov HaKadosh. I do feel that now we've reached a new level in our shir when we have shir sponsorships in honor of Rebbes. This is very, very important. Although again, I'm shocked that none of our Chabad Chaverim sponsored the shir today in honor of Yud Tes Kislev. Shocking, and frankly, makes me doubt your entire commitment to the movement. I'm just saying. I don't know. Good. We'll say with that. So we hope that in merit of our Talmud Torah, all the Neshama Shav and Ali, the families in Nechama, all those who need Refuah Shav together with Kol Cholei Yisrael, Halavai Meretz Hashem, the Balatanya, Zuchos Yogen Aleinu, the Magid of Mezrich, Zuchos Yogen Aleinu, the Meretz Hashem Shebe Melitze Yosher for Klal Yisrael, Halavai. We should be Zochei Meretz Hashem to be inspired by their Torah, and we should be Zochei Meretz Hashem to give their precious Neshamas a beautiful Aliyah. I will say today's Daf is Daf Pei Vav 86, and it is good. It is good. Meretz Hashem at the Mishnah on Pehem Beis 85b. The Mishnah is no, we're not. Sorry, that was a good try. I thought if I said it fast enough, no one would catch up on it. Okay, good. Wow. Okay, good morning. Good. Baruch Hashem. So we are picking up Meretz Hashem at Rabbi Chanina Skan HaKohanim. Right? All right, yes, good. Rabbi Chanina Skan HaKohanim, 4 lines down into the wide line. So remember, again, Rabbi Chanina Skan HaKohanim. So also, interestingly enough, in the Mishnah, Rabbi Chanina Skan HaKohanim was quoted as saying, the lashon was, Rabbi Chanina Skan HaKohanim, just trying to find it, was mentioned as Omer Docha Haya Abbas Balimum Me'agabe HaMizbeach. That my father, said my father would push, Docha literally means he'd push away any type of blemished animals from sacrificial service. So the Gemara says, okay, my Kamash Malon. What is Rabbi Chanina Skan HaKohanim teaching us? In other words, we already established that aside from Rabbi Akiva, everyone agreed that Bali Mumin do not go up on the Mizbeach, and even if they did, they're taken down. So what exactly is Rabbi Chanina Skan HaKohanim, what is he adding? To which the Gemara says, Ibais Ema Maisa Kamash Malon. Possibility number one is he's not adding anything new. What is he just saying? He's adding a Maisa. What does he mean adding a Maisa? He's telling you, by the way, it happened. So I will say, you see this, sometimes the Gemara will go out and say halacha, and then someone quotes a story that backs that up. That's obviously always powerful. Why? Because when you could quote a story that actually puts the halacha into practice, that just shows that it was adopted halacha l'maisa. Okay, by sema my doche kila achya. The other possibility is that Rabbi Chanina Skan HaKohanim was saying like this: as much as we will not put obviously a bal mum on the mizbeach, and if you put it on, you have to take it off. When you take it off, we do it kila achayad. Kila achayad means we do it kind of in a nuanced, almost like beneath the radar type of way. Why? Because what do we have to be concerned about? We have to be concerned that halacha l'maisa, that this looks disparaging to karbanos, right? Because no one really knows the full story about what's going on over here. Therefore, even though we're going to take it off the mizbeach, Rashi says kila achrayad right across in Rashi, ein moridin derech bizayim befarhesya. We don't take it off the mizbeach in a degrading fashion, in a public fashion. So we kind of do it quietly, no one's looking, which I will say is a tremendous musar, that sometimes in life, you have to do things that are uncomfortable, and you have to do things that may even offend people. It happens. You have to say something that's going to be offensive. You have to do something that's going to be upsetting. And there are times in life, whether it's as a parent, as a friend, as a leader, sometimes you just have to do things that people aren't going to like. it's important that when we do those things, we do so in a way that minimizes the embarrassment, that minimizes the damage, that minimizes the hurt. Incredible. Kishem Shim Allah Amar Ula. So remember again, the Mishnah then ended off with a rule. What was the rule? The same way that we said that halacha l'mais, right? We've been dealing with this whole sugya where if you put something that wasn't supposed to go on the mizbeach, but you put it on the mizbeach, right? What do? Lo tered, you don't put it on. However, the Gemara says, if let's say you put something on the mizbeach that wasn't supposed to be on the mizbeach, so you leave it there. But if you took it off, then what? You don't put it back on. Right? Because again, logically, I would have thought that, listen, once the halacha is that if you put it on, you don't take it off, then maybe if you take it off, you just put it back on. Kamash Malon, no. Once you took it off, then halacha l'maisi, you don't go and return it back. Amr Ula said, 1 second. Lo shana ala shalom mashla b'hana ar. That's only true if the fire did not take hold of it. However, ava mashla b'hana ar yalu. But I will say, let's say again, you have an invalid carbon. That halacha l'maisa, again, you were supposed to go ahead and not put it on the mizbeach. You put it on the mizbeach. And now what happens? The fires began to burn it. Then you took it off the mizbeach. Ula says in that case you could put it back on. Because again, once the fire took hold of it, you could put it back on. Rav Mari Masni Aresha. So Rav Mari, so this was his gear. So Rav Chanina, Misura Masni Aseifa. So Rav Chanina of Surah, he went ahead and he put this halacha on the Seifa. What's the Seifa? The Seifa is the very next Mishnah that we're going to discuss. Ha'atzamos v'hagidim v'akarnayim v'atalfayim. So this is actually the next Mishnah. The sinews, the bones, the horns, the hoofs of the animal. Bizman shemechubarin yalu. When they are connected to, let's say, the rest of the animal, they go on the mizbeach. Otherwise, if they are detached, they do not get put on the mizbeach. Perish lo yalu. If they're detached, you don't put them on. Amra Ula says, when is that true that if they're detached, you don't put them on? Lo shana ala shalamash labana ar. That's only if the fire did not take hold of them. Avamash labana ar. But if the fire took hold of them already, yalu. Halacha l'maisa, you keep them on the mizbeach. To which the Gemara says, so machlokes as to when to apply this. Man demasni aseifa kol shekin aresha. So the one who applies it to the seifa, to the horn, to the sinews, which is the case we're going to get to in just a moment, certainly would agree that this applies to sacrificial meat. Or man demasni aresha, the one who understands this talking about the resha, about the sacrificial meat, avala seifa, when it comes to the seifa, the case of the bones, the sinews, which we're going to talk about in just a moment, lav b'nei aktardenu. They're not normally fit to be burned at all. Say, even if they accidentally went on the mizbeach, and even if the fire went ahead and began to take hold of them, if halacha l'maisa they come off the mizbeach, you don't put them back on. Incredible. All right, so I'll say, so bottom line, what's the takeaway? The takeaway is like this. So first of all, we've established, right, as a principle is, there are many types of karbanos, actually most types of karbanos, invalid karbanos, that if they go on the mizbeach, once they're on, you don't take them off. We do adopt the principle of Rabbi Shimon, which is, what kind of disqualification does this apply to? A disqualification that developed inside of the Beis HaMikdash. But if the animal had a disqualification that preceded its entry into the Beis HaMikdash, even if it was erroneously put on the mizbeach, right, what do? You take it off. A good example of that would be a Baal Mum. If you accidentally put a Baal Mum carbon on the Mizbeach, everyone except Rabbi Akiva will agree, you take it off. You take it off. Why? Because that was a pre-existing condition. Everything was a pre-existing condition. Ultimately, again, even if you put it on erroneously, you take it back off. Ula says, and even the items that you would normally just leave on, if they come off, don't put it back on. That's the Mishnah. Don't put it back on. However, Ula just says, if the fires already got hold of it, then even if it came off, you would put it back on. Incredible. Says the Mishnah. We'll say, here we go. Ve'elu im alu yerdu. So we'll say, so now this is very interesting. The Mishnah says, but there is, however, a list of items that even if you put them on the Mizbeach erroneously, take it off. Take it off. So remember again, up until now, for the last couple of days, right, we have been dealing with the sugya, I think the last 2 days, right, we've been dealing with the sugya of karbanos that you should have never put on the mizbeach, or sacrificial parts you should never put on the mizbeach, but if you did it, lo tered. Now the Mishnah transitions. The following is a list of items, where even if you erroneously put it on, take it off. Okay, here we go. What is it? Number 1, basar kachei kadoshim, basar gachim kalim. The meat of kachei kadoshim and the meat of kachim kalim. Now, both say, now, why is it that if these items are erroneously put on, ultimately, again, that you take them off? Why? Because we'll remember again, carbonic meat has no place on the Mizbeach. This is consumed either by Kohanim or consumed by the owners. Remember again, this is not the sacrificial parts. This is the meat, the basar, the part that's normally consumed. So therefore, again, I will say, if this was erroneously put on the Mizbeach, you take it off because it has no place there. It has no sheikhs. Actually, if you look at Rashi, Rashi says over here, ve'elu im alu yardu, second wide line, afa pi shekshirin. Now, I will say, I want to point out something over here. In this case, these karbanos are kosher, right? Up until now, we've been focusing on cases of invalid karbanos, which were accidentally placed on the Mizbeach. Now we're talking about valid karbanos. But what did you do? What was the mistake over here? You put a part of the karban on the Mizbeach that has no shaykhus, no connection to the Mizbeach. So for example, you took sacrificial meat, which should normally be consumed by the Kohen or be consumed by the owner, you put it on the Mizbeach, get that off. Get that off, the Mishnah says. Terry, take it off. It has no shaykhus. Incredible. Next. Mosra Omer, the leftover, the carbon Omer. And again, remember again, carbon Omer is a mincha offering. Whenever you go out and you offer up a mincha offering, what part gets put on the Mizbeach? What gets put on the Mizbeach? Kamitza, right? The rest of it is consumed. If you put the rest of it on the Mizbeach, get that off. Once again, no shaykhas to the Mizbeach. Shtei alechem, the 2-loaf offering of Shavuos. Once again, no shaykhas to the Mizbeach. Lechem apanim is a good one. Rabbi say, what happens with lechem apanim? What happens with lechem apanim? Right, lechem apanim, ultimately, again, you put the levona on, but the lechem apanim is consumed by the kohanim. So therefore, again, no shaykhas to the Mizbeach. Shiari menachos, anything of the leftover menachos. Leftover menachos means anything besides the kmitza. Kitores, semer sheberoshe kvasim, v'seyar shebezakin tiyashim. Literally, again, the wool that is on the head of sheep, or ultimately, again, the beard, like literally the hair, the beard hair, we'll call it, of rams. So Rashi points out over here, if you look at Rashi, Semer Shabarashak Vasim, Rashi says over here, 3 lines from the bottom, Reisha de Babachrisi. Now, I will say that, interestingly enough, as much as these heads were severed, right, ultimately, again, right, well, actually, we'll get into the heads. In all of these cases, I will say, so the halach, right, or let's finish the list, Hat Samos, bones, I will say, so again, in the previous parts over here, Salach Alamaisa, again, these are just items that don't normally go on the Mizbeach. So because they don't go on the Mizbeach, therefore, Allah Alamaisa, if you erroneously put it on, ultimately, again, you have to go ahead and take it off. It has no shaykhus l'gabi ha-Mizbeach. In this last part, Atzamos, bones, Gidim, sinews, Karnaim, horns, Tafayim, hooves, so both say, Bizman Shem Mechubar and Yalu. When they are attached to the sacrificial parts, ultimately, again, you could offer them up on the Mizbeach. Shenemar vehiktira koines hakol. As the Pasuk says, the coin will burn everything. Pirshu, however, ultimately, again, if they're separated, so both say, so again, if they're not part of the primary sacrificial parts, lo yalu. They do not go up on the Mizbeach. Shene'emar va'asisa olasecha habasar v'hadam. You will do your olah, the meat and the blood, which indicates that it's the meat and the blood that's offered up, but these secondary parts, the bones, the sinews, the hooves, the horns, again, this is not offered up. Not offered up. Incredible. Incredible. So let's go ahead. So I'll just tell you something very beautiful. The Shlomo of Radamsk, the Mincha Shlomo, Tifer Shlomo, says something very beautiful. He says, what do you see from here? He says, sometimes something, when it's on its own, is insignificant. Right? So going ahead, so let's say the bones, the sinews, the horns, the hoofs, right? These items by themselves are totally insignificant. Yet, when you attach them, when they are attached to the sacrificial parts, suddenly they become significant. So the Rebbe says, sometimes in life, I can't get it together on my own. I'm just having a difficult time getting traction. What's part of the secret of success? Attach yourself to something or to someone holy. When you surround yourself, when you attach yourself, again, to a tzaddik, when you attach yourself to someone, and by the way, it doesn't have to be an individual. When you attach yourself to a chabura, right? When you put yourself in a base medrash, you put yourself in a base hakneses, you put yourself in a kehillah, you attach yourself to something bigger and holier than yourself. Sometimes, even though individually you may be insignificant, when you attach yourself to something that is holy, ultimately, again, that gives you holiness. Such an incredible yisod. Says the Gemara, Tan Rabbanon, Victor Koines Hakol Mizbecha, L'Rabos Hatzamos V'Agidim V'Akarnai V'Atalfayim. So we'll say again. So the pasuk says, Victor Koines Hakol. So I just want to point out over here. So if you notice, there's two psukim. One pasuk says, Victor Koines Hakol, that ultimately the coin will burn everything. That's one pasuk. The second pasuk says, V'Asisa Olasecha Habasar V'Hadam. You will give up your carbon, right? Or you will offer up your carbon, the meat and the blood. So which one is it? Do you burn everything or do you just burn the meat and the blood? So the way the Mishnah understood it was, it depends. If halacha l'maisa, these secondary items like the bone, the sinews, the horns, and the hoofs are attached to the carbon, then you burn everything. If they're detached, then you don't offer them up on the mizbeach. You only offer up the meat and the blood. So turn Rabbanon. V'hiktra koines hakol mizbecha l'rabos. So a pasuk says the kohen will burn everything. This comes to include the bones, the sinews, the horns, and the hoofs. You might have thought this is true even if what? Even if they separate from the sacrificial parts. Talmud Lomar, V'asisa olasecha basar v'hadam. You shall perform your carbon, the meat and the blood. So Gemara says, okay, which means it's just the meat and the blood, not the rest of it. I basar v'hadam, top of Pevav, Yochel yachlotz, gidin v'atzamos v'ya'ale basar l'gabe mizbeach. So I might have thought that halacha l'maisa, since it just says you offer up the basar and the dam, maybe halacha l'maisa dafka have to separate off these other items. Again, I'm not going to keep going through the list, but the other items again is the bones, the sinews, the horns, and the hoofs. To which the Gemara says, Talmud Lomar v'hiktra kohen es hakol. So the pasuk says the kohen shall burn everything. So obviously, how does this work? How does this work? So in other words, right now when I get started, right? So the bones, the sinews, the hoofs, and the horns are attached. So on one hand the pasuk says burn everything, but on the other hand the pasuk says burn the meat and the blood. So what should I do? Haketzad michubarin yalu pirsh sabasa michubarin yalu. So how does this work? Number one, if it's attached, offer up everything. Offer up everything. Pirshu, if they somehow become detached, afiluhin barosh hamizbeach yerdu. If they become detached, even if these items are already on the top of the mizbeach, take it down. Take it down, that's the halacha. Fine. So the Gemara says, Man tana the shamis le pirshu yardu. So we'll say, who is the opinion? Now, we'll say, by the way, that last statement is a pretty strong one, right? That last statement, that in other words, that if they become detached from the carbon, even if they're on the top of the mizbeach, take it down. That's a pretty strong statement. Who is the opinion that says that? It's Rabbi Tisanya, because the pasuk says, Baisa says, Victor kohen esak kol mizbecha. Pasuk says the kohen should burn everything on the mizbeach. L'rabos ha'atzamos v'hagidim v'karnayim v'atalfayim afilu pershu. Listen to this. So on one hand, this opinion says, the pasuk says the kohen should burn everything. What's everything? Everything means everything. The meat, right? The meat and the blood, and also again the hoofs, the horns, the bones, the sinews, even if they separated from the primary meat. So what do you do with the pasuk that says you shall perform your carbon, the meat and the blood, which makes it sound like it's only the meat and the blood that's the primary part of the carbon. Lomar lacha, to teach us the following halacha: ikule ola. Atamachzir via tamachzir ikule gidin va'atzamos. So we'll say we're going to talk about this more. It comes to teach us a very important halacha. It teaches a very important halacha that halacha l'maisa, even if you have parts of the ola that were partially consumed, we're going to talk about this. We'll say about sacrificial parts that fall off of the mizbeach. What do you do then? What do you do with it? So we're going to see that even partially consumed parts of the ola get returned to the mizbeach. But yet, interestingly enough, if you have partially consumed bones, sinews, horns, hoofs, and they'll fall off the mizbeach, that is not returned to the mizbeach. Okay, that's the first opinion. Rabbi on the other hand says a little bit differently. Rabbi Omer, Kasuf Echad Omer v'hiktra kohen es hakol mizbecha. On one hand, the pasuk says the kohen shall burn everything on the mizbeach. Riba, so the Gemara says Riba. Obviously, what does that include? That includes everything. That includes everything. V'kasav echad omer v'asisa olasecha basar v'hadam. And then another pasuk says, you shall go ahead and do your olah, the meat and the blood. So we'll say, so miyat. That's obviously a miyat. So we'll say, so again, this is our tension. One pasuk seems to indicate you burn everything, and everything would include, again, the bones, the sinews, the hoofs, and the horns. Another pasuk says, no, all you burn is the meat and the blood. So Hakeitzad, how do you reconcile this? Hakeitzad, michu barin yalu. Okay, very simple. This is Rabbi say. If they are attached, then you offer everything up. Pirshu, if they become detached, afilin berosh hamizbeach yerdu. Even if it's on the top of the mizbeach, take it down. So Rabbi say, and our Mishnah reflects this view of Rebbe. So again, the primary sacrificial parts that you burn, sacrificial meat, right, sacrificial limbs, and blood. What about these secondary parts of the animal? So essentially, halacha l'maisa, if they're attached, burn it as well. But if they're detached, you do not burn it. What's the chiddush? Even if they become detached, on the top of their already on the mizbeach, top of the zech, what do? Take it down. Incredible. Perishal, yeah, so the Gemara examines a little bit more. Perishal, Rebbe said that if they detached, right, if these secondary parts detached from the carbon, even on the top of the mizbeach, take it down. Am Rabbi Zera, lo shana ela shepirshu klabe mata. So this is very interesting. It's fascinating. Rabbi Zera says that's only true if literally again they detached further away from the fires, right? So in other words, when they became detached, because remember, even if they become detached on the mizbeach, you take it down. That's only true if they became detached in a way that now they're further away from the fire. Aval klape mala, but if they become detached closer to the fire, then kruve hu da'akriv le'ikol. Ultimately, again, then halacha l'maisa, the fact that they became detached closer to the fire, we burn them. So we'll say it's almost, which is just a fascinating idea. Rabbi Zira is saying that we look at did they become detached in further proximity, or I should say closer proximity, or further away from the fire, and that ultimately again will determine whether or not they're burned. Fascinating. Vafilu, the Gemara says vafilu pershu. So I'm sorry. Good avakla. Good. Avakla kruva dakriliko. The Gemara says vafilu pershu. So you're telling me then this means that 1 second. That if these items, again, the horns, the hoofs, the bones, the sinews, even if they're totally detached, we look at the proximity to the fire of their detachment, because it sounds like we just got finished saying before that if they got detached, then what? We don't offer it up at all, we take it down. So what's going on there? This is what it means to say, Lo shanu ela shepirshu la'achar zrika. Okay, this is very interesting. So Rabbi said like this, that halacha l'maisa, when do we say that if they became detached, that they're taken down? When is that? It's true only when they became detached after zrika. Look at Rashi for just a moment. Rashi is lo shanu, it's the second short line. Lo shanu, dika amar pirshu yerdu. When do we say that if these items became detached, that they're taken down from the mizbeach? That's only when umiu isnu b'chal kodshim ela shepirshu la'achar zrika, t'chivit shebisas zrika mechubarim, so the Gemara says, havu kavasan zrika l'mizbeach, v'chi pirshu havulu kodshim psulim. So listen to this. When do we say they're taken down? When is that? That's when they became detached after Zrika. Why? Because watch this. If they're attached at the time of Zrika, that essentially means they become sanctified as a carbon. When they then become detached, they're essentially invalid carbonos. What happens with invalid carbonos? We burn it off the mizbeach. So that's what it means when we say take it down. However, back to the Gemara about Pirshu Kodim Zrika, but if they became detached, ultimately again before Zrika, and therefore I will say at the time of Zrika, ultimately again, they were not part of the primary carbon, then interestingly enough, Zrika, since Zrika was done with them in a detached state, they never become part of the carbon, and they're actually fit even for mundane use, which is pretty incredible. Aval Pirshu Kodim Zrika, if ultimately it detaches prior to Zrika, Asoy Zrika v'sharsinu afilu leme'aved minayo kata desakini. So we'll say, so if it was detached, it's fascinating. If it was detached from the carbon, so again, the horns, the hoofs, the bones, the sinews. If it was detached from the carbon at the time of Zrika, it never became consecrated. If it never became consecrated, it's permitted for mundane use, to the point the Gemara says you could even make a candle out of it. Okay, it's just giving an example of mundane use. Quite fascinating. Savarla kiyaitana. Sarah Lakiha, Rabbi Yochanan, Mishnah Rabbi Shmuel. Ne'amar lo yihiyeh ba'olah, the ne'amar lo yihiyeh ba'asham. So we'll say, it says ultimately again, lo yihiyeh, it will be his by olah, and it says lo yihiyeh by asham. Ma asham atzmos of mutarin, af olah atzamos mutarin. So we'll say, isn't this fascinating? So now this is another distinction. When do the bones, and again, it's everything, that grouping is always the same, bones, sinews, horns, hoofs. When do they become prohibited? When they are attached to the carbon at the time of zrika. Because again, if you're attached to a carbon at the time of zrika, that concretizes your identity as a carbon. When they if they remain attached, then they're burned. If they become detached, then ultimately they're disqualified carbonic matter and they're burned separately off the mizbeach. If, however, they became detached before the zrika, then their carbonic identity was never concretized, and therefore what? It's permitted for mundane use, to the point that you could even make a knife handle out of the bones, or do whatever you want with the sinews. You can do whatever you want. So the Gemara says, where do we get this from? This is Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Shmuel. It says, Lo yihiyeh, it shall be yours by olah, and it says, Lo yihiyeh by asham. What's the connection? Ma asham atzmos of mutarin. Just like by an asham, the bones of an asham are mutar for mundane use. Af ola at samos mutarin. So too by an ola, the bones are mutar from mundane use. Now, obviously, remember, the Gemara is giving this in a very specific way. This is when the bones were not attached at the time of zrika. If the bones were attached at the time of zrika, everything becomes consecrated as a carbon. To which the Gemara says mufni. But say mufni means that obviously this phrase lo yihiyah is not used for anything else, and therefore is open to be used for this gezerah shava. Di lo mufni, because again, if this was not open, ikal mifrach, there's a pircha on this gezerah shava. What's the pircha? Ma lo asham shekin besaro mutter. Again, I say it's pretty hard to make a gezerah shava between asham and olah for one simple reason. There's a big distinction. What's the distinction? Asham, the meat is consumed by kohanim. Ola, the meat is not consumed at all. To which the Gemara says, you're right, lo yihiyah yisir ksiv. Obviously, it's openable saying this phrase, lo yihiyah, is an extra phrase, and therefore it can be used to teach us this drasha. Incredible. So Maser Rav Ada bar Rava, so Rav Ada bar Rava ultimately again, so he raised the kasha, at samos kachim lifnei zrika molin bohen. Suppose this, here we go. So Rav Ada bar Rava raises the kasha, at samos kachim, which is the bones of kachim, before zrika, molin bohen. They are subject to mi'ilah. Ula achar zrika ein molin bohen. But after zrika, ultimately again, there is no mi'ilah. V'shal ola, but the bones of an ola, molin bahem li olam, are always subject to mi'ilah. Now both say, now this contradicts what we just said before, because we've been talking about ola, and we suggested before that even by ola, if the bones are attached at the time of zrika, then ultimately again, subject to, then ultimately concretized as kachim and pashtos, subject to mi'ilah. If they're detached before zrika, then not a problem. Here it says that the bones of an ola are subject to mi'ilah forever. To which the Gemara says, no. The aim must say the following: V'shel ola, when it comes to the bones of ola, pirshu lifnei zrika, ein molin bahem. If the bones detach from the sacrificial meat before zrika, there's no me'ilah, which Rabbi says exactly what we've been saying up until now. Because remember again, zrika concretizes identity. So therefore, if the bones are attached to sacrificial meat at the time of zrika, then the bones become kachim. If they're kachim, they're subject to me'ilah. The achar zrika, but ultimately again, pirshul lifnei zrika. So therefore, if the bones separate from the sacrificial meat before zrika, ein molin bahem. They're not kachim, and therefore there's no me'ilah. La'achar zrika, if however the bones became detached from the meat only after zrika, then molin bahem li olam. They're forever subject to me'ilah, which then supports exactly what we were saying before. Upliga Rabbi Lazar, this argues on Rabbi Lazar. Rabbi Lazar, pirshu lifnei zrika molin bahem. Rabbi Lazar says that ultimately, again, if the bones separated from the meat before zrika, then there's mi'ilah. La'achar zrika lo nanin v'lo molin. But after zrika, ultimately again, you can't get hana, but it's also not subject to mi'ilah. So therefore, both sides argues Rabbi Lazar. So therefore, both say it turns out, it sounds like the way the Gemara is ultimately concluding is the following. So first of all, just to kind of summarize, when it comes to these items. So first of all, this Mishnah introduced us to a new category of items that even if you place it on the mizbeach, you take it down. What category does that apply to? Items that have no shaykhs to the mizbeach. So let's say sacrificial meat that would normally be consumed. You accidentally put that on the mizbeach, take it down. What's the status of bones, sinews, horns, and hoofs? What's their status in terms of sacrificial meat? So the Gemara essentially says, like Rebbe, it depends. What does it depend on? Are they attached, right? If it's attached, ultimately, again, it gets offered up. If it's detached, ultimately, again, it needs to come down. But even that detached idea, everything depends on what? When did it become detached, right? If it became detached before Zriga, then it's totally mundane. Totally mundane. You can use it to make a handle from your knife. If it became detached ultimately after Zrika, then you have to treat it as invalidated karbanos, in which case it's not burned on the Mizbeach, it's burned off the Mizbeach, but it's certainly not permitted for mundane use. Incredible. Mishnah. V'chulun shepako me'agabe Mizbeach lo yachzir. So we'll say this is now what we referenced before. Any item, Kulan, any of these items, and Rashi says over here, Hanach psulin sha'alu disnan bahem lo yerdu bein atzamos v'gidin shehelan muchubra v'achal tanaish. So now the Mishnah says like this. Any of these cases where we paskin im Allah lo seiret, which was the previous sugis. So the cases where items should not have been offered up on the Mizbeach, but they were put on the Mizbeach. So what's the halacha? Once you put it on, don't take it off. If literally, again, pakur bosa means they popped off the Mizbeach, right? Which means what? It's on the fire is very hot. Sometimes the intense heat causes it to pop off. If it popped off, ultimately, again, you do not put it back on. Lo yachzir, v'chein gachela shepakam agav Mizbeach lo yachzir. Similarly, again, if you have a coal that popped off the Mizbeach, don't put it back on. So now it's a very interesting halacha. So again, if you have, and by the way, I will say that first halacha is not such a novelty, because remember again, what did the Mishnah say? Any of those cases of the karbanos that you should have never put on Mizbeach to begin with. But once you put it on, what's the halacha? What's the halacha? Lo teireit. But yeah, what does the Mishnah say? If you took it off, then what? You don't put it back on. So similarly again, if you left it on and it popped off, you don't put it back on. A coal that pops off, you don't put it back on. Now listen to this. Ivarim shepakom megabe amizbeach. Now Bepashtos, this is talking about over here, what about sacrificial limbs that are not, now remember again, at night, what karbanos do we offer up at night? What karbanos? None. There are no karbanos at night. So what do you do at night in the Beis HaMikdash? You burn the leftover sacrificial limbs and fats. So let's say again, the Kohen is doing his job, he's burning the sacrificial limbs, and now they pop off the Mizbeach. So what's the halacha? Kodim chatzos yachzir. If it was before chatzos, right before midnight, you put him back on. And they're subject to me'ilah. La'achar chatzos, but if it popped off after chatzos, lo yachzir, don't put it back on the mizbeach. Ve'ein mo'alin bahem, and there's no me'ilah for these limbs after chatzos. Okay, we'll see what that means. Kashem sham mizbeach mekadesh es haroilo, kacha kevesh mekadesh. The same way that the mizbeach consecrates that which is fit for it, so too the ramp up to the mizbeach has the ability to consecrate. We'll see what that means. Kashem sham mizbeach va'kevesh mekadeshin es haroilahan, kacha kila mekadeshin. And in the same way, ultimately again, that both the mizbeach and the ramp have the ability to sanctify, to consecrate, so too a klisharis, a service utensil, also has the ability to consecrate as well. All right, so let's analyze this. So now, what we are most intrigued by in this Mishnah is this whole chatzos thing, right? So you have sacrificial limbs, and again, now we're talking about like legitimate karbanos. That's supposed to be there. You're burning sacrificial limbs at night. So what did the Mishnah say? Before chatzos, if the limbs pop off, put it back on, and the limbs are subject to me'ilah. After chatzos, if they pop off, you don't have to put it back on, and it's not subject to me'ilah. What's up with that? So one says, hey chidami, I don't understand. If the limbs still have meat on them, then even if they pop off after chatzos, you should still be obligated to put them back on. And if the meat has already burned off and there's nothing left, then even if it pops off before chatzos, you shouldn't have to put it back on. So what's going on over here? Bishiriri. What's the case over here? Shiriri. What's shiriri? Rashi says, Kashin sheniskashu machmas ha'ish sheshalta b'hem b'kulam v'nisrafu ela shelo nasu pacham ela ke'etz mi'aveshim hemitocham. What's the case here, Rabbosai? Where the meat has already become like shiriri. Shiriri means, Rabbosai, that it's already dried out. It's already dried out. It's like a piece of wood, but it has not yet gotten to the point of coal. So therefore, again, if it pops off before chatzos, you got to put it back on. But if it's after chatzos, right? And I will say these two things go together. You have to put it back on, and it is subject to me'ilah. Those two things go together. After chatzos, you don't have to put it back on because it's considered to be like coal already, and it's not subject to me'ilah. So one second. Where do you get this distinction between chatzos and after chatzos? Where do you know that from? So this is very interesting. Amarav, kasav echad omer, kol halayla vehektir, v'kasav echad omer, kol halayla veherim. So this is very interesting. So you actually have two psukim over here that deal with the ola. So the pasuk says, by beginning of the ola, it says, Hi ola al mokda al mizbeach kol halayla. So the pasuk says, what do you do with the ola? You keep the ola on the mizbeach, kol halayla, the entire night, ad haboker, until the morning. The next pasuk then, literally the next pasuk says, "Vehirim es hadeshen asher tochal ha'esh es ha'ola." The next pasuk then literally says, "Kol halayla vehirim." Right? The next pasuk says, it doesn't actually say kol halayla, but the next pasuk says vehirim. You shall lift up the ash. So, what is the Gemara struggling with over here? On one hand, it calls the ola that remains, right, because you're burning the sacrificial parts at night. It calls it an ola, and then it calls it ash. So which one is it? Right? When it burns throughout the night, is it ola or is it ash? So the Gemara says, chalkiu. So what do? We split the night. Chatziav l'haktara, v'chatziav l'harama. Part of the night is for the offering, and part of the night is for the raising of the ash, which essentially means part of the night the sacrificial limbs are looked at as meat, and part of the night they're looked at as ash. And I will say, what's that distinction? Chatzos. Prior to chatzos, it's looked at as sacrificial meat, and therefore, again, halacha l'maaseh pops off the mizbeach. You have to put it back on, and it is subject to me'ilah. And after chatzos, ultimately, again, it is looked at as ash, and therefore, if it pops off the mizbeach, you need not put it back on, and it is not subject to me'ilah. Okay, so Master Rav Kana raised the kasha. Shabbat said, "This is incredible. It's incredible Gemara. B'chol yom tarim v'samizech mikros hagever o samachlo milafanav o me'acharav." So remember again, in general, remember the first avoda of the day. The first avoda of the day was Shubas Hadeshen, right? Which means removal of the ash. Now the truth is, they didn't remove all of the ash. They just removed a very small amount of ash and deposited it by the side of the Mizbeach. So every day, mikros hagever. Now, both like kros hagever is also an interesting term. It can mean dawn, right? So kros hagever could mean like the crow of the rooster, which means dawn. Kros hagever could also be literally translated. Kros hagever means the crying out of the individual, which Bepashtos was the Kohen who was in charge of, or the Levi who was in charge of getting everyone up in the morning. So the halacha is, when do you do Trumas Hadeshen? Mikros hagever o samuchlo milafanav al acharav. So if you look at Rashi says over here, Rashi says, actually before I get to Rashi. So when do you do Trumas Hadeshen? Ultimately, again, from Kros HaGever, from dawn, either a little bit before or a little bit afterwards. Okay? Now watch this. B'Yom Kippurim bechatzos. Yom Kippur, they would do Trumas Hadeshen already when? As of midnight. Now again, Rashi points out over here, let's go through the We'll see why that is. Right? Beregalim, on the Regalim, Yom Tov and Pesach Shavuos Sukkos, Bashmaras Harishona. They would already do Trumas Hadeshen, already when? After the first third of the night. Gemara Maseches Brachos, the night is divided up into Ivaz Machlokes, 3 Ashmoros, 4 Ashmoros. Here we're going into there's 3 Ashmoros. They would do it from the first third of the night. So just so you understand, on a typical day, Trumas Hadeshen would be done somewhere around dawn, a little bit before, a little bit afterwards. On Yom Kippur, they would back it up to midnight, Chatzos, and ultimately, again, on the Regalim, Yom Tovim, they would already do it before Chatzos. Very interesting. Now what's the shaila? I don't understand. But 1 second. Based on what you just said before, by Ola Bosai, so remember again, when do sacrificial limbs become ash? When do they become ash? When? Midnight. Midnight. So first of all, Trumas Hadeshen then should really happen at midnight. So first of all, it's a number of kashas. How do you do it earlier? How is it by Yom Tiv? You're going ahead and you're doing it before Chatzos, and then in reality, on any given day, how are you waiting after Chatzos? How are you waiting till dawn? What's going on over here? So we'll say, watch this. Ela Amr Rabbi Yochanan, Mimashma Shenemar Kol HaLayla, Eni Odesh Ad HaBoker, Ma Talmud Lomar Ad HaBoker. So we'll say, now watch this. So the Gemara says, in general, by this pasuk of Olos, remember again, there's two psukim happening over here. What the first pasuk, and they're successive psukim, right? This is Vayikra, Parak Vav, pasuk Beis, and pasuk Gimel. The first pasuk is talking about Ola and tells me, what do you do with the sacrificial limbs of the Ola? What do? You let them burn throughout the night. The next pasuk, it says Ad HaBoker. They Kol HaLayla, the entire night, Ad HaBoker. The next pasuk then says, you shall go ahead and remove the ash. Those are the juxtaposed psukim. So then the Gemara asks, I don't understand. The pasuk says, let the Ola burn, Kol HaLayla, Ad HaBoker, until the morning. That's repetitive, right? That's repetitive. If you're telling me Kol HaLayla, so by definition, Kol HaLayla means what? Kol HaLayla means until the morning. Why do I need to say Ad HaBoker? So watch this. Rabbi says, Ma Talmud Lomar Ad HaBoker, get ready. Tein Boker lebakro shalayla. It means give an additional morning to the dawn of the night. So Rabbi say, interestingly enough, Ad HaBoker teaches us. See, if it would have just said Kol HaLayla means until dawn. The fact that it says Ad HaBoker means sometimes morning comes earlier, sometimes morning comes later, right? That ultimately, again, morning, that happens to many of us, right? So that ultimately, again, so sometimes morning comes at different times. Take a look at Rashi says over here. Tein boker lebakro shalayla. It's about 7 lines up from the bottom. Tein boker lebakro shalayla. Boker shalayla alos hashachar. Boker achar teilo. So normally, again, boker is dawn, but sometimes you give a different morning. So the Gemara says, Hainu hashkama v'chevan te'ein zman l'davar ela shel hashkama hakol lefi tzorach hasha. So Moshe says, here's what's interesting. It's actually quite fascinating. So the Torah tells me sometimes you have to create another morning, but the Torah doesn't tell me what that morning is, and therefore gave the power to the rabbis to determine when morning occurs in different circumstances. Therefore, kol Yomi kros hagever sagi. Therefore, generally, on a regular day, when do you do Trumas Hadeshen? When do you do Trumas Hadeshen? Again, dawn, because that's enough time. B'Yom Kippurim, mishum chosha the kohen gadol mechatzos. Ultimately, we'll say on Yom Kippur, because we want to have a little bit of Rachmanas on the Kohen Gadol, right? Because remember, in Yom Kippur, everything has to be done by the Kohen Gadol. So therefore, what we do is, we allow him to do Trumas Hadeshen already as of midnight. That way, kind of get that done, and he has a little bit of time to rest until he has to begin the Avodah of Yom Kippur. U'b'regalim, on the Yom Tovim, the Nefishi Karbanos, because remember, I will say, on the Regalim, you have a plethora of Karbanos, right? On the Regalim in general, you have a ton of Karbanos, because remember, again, in general, Yom Tov has a lot of Karbanos, but also because there's a mitzvah aliyah l'regel, that's when everyone is catching up on all of their sacrificial obligations. Therefore, Shabbos say it's just so beautiful. Asu Yisrael me'ashmoras harishona. So on Yom Kippur, on the Regalim, Pesach, Shavuos, Sukkos, already again, Klal Yisrael was already gathering, they were already filling up the Beis HaMikdash from the beginning of the night. Kediktani Seifa, lo haisa kriyas hagever magas, at shahaisa azora meleim Yisrael. Even before dawn, the courtyard was packed. The courtyard was packed ultimately again with Klal Yisrael. Rabbi say, isn't that incredible? So because there were so many people, so Rabbi say, interestingly enough, it's a fascinating halacha. So much to say over here, but a fascinating halacha. So in general, the Torah says, let the Ola stay until the morning. But then the pasuk says, Ad HaBoker. Why that phrase? That phrase teaches me that Chazal have the right to determine different mornings for different times. So on Stam day, ultimately again, you do Trumas Hadeshen when? Dawn. Yom Kippur, back it up to Chatzos. Yom Tiv, first third of the night. Why on Yom Tiv? Because it was on Yom Tovim, before it was even dawn, the courtyard of the Beis HaMikdash was already packed. Rabbi say such an incredible and beautiful. Just enough about saying, that phrase. There's a profound Musar Haskell in that phrase. Lo haisa kriyas hagever magas. Actually, we'll say, we'll stop over for today. All right, tomorrow we'll start off with that. 6:45. We'll say, what a daf. Shkayach, everyone. All right, Chavrazim, have a great day.